Illegal immigration changed Virginia, and no dumbest bill in America, but we do have lots of dumbest bills coming up and episodes coming up in the future as we've been researching these dumbest bills because there's no shortage of dumbest bills. But this podcast is called Illegal Immigration Changed Virginia. You probably know this, but surprisingly, those folks who live outside of the greater Washington area aren't as informed about this particular issue. Namely, how has Virginia changed from this state that everybody thought was this deep southern state that had Confederate flags everywhere and people were country bumpkins and so forth? This is the perception that so many people have and had of the state of Virginia. But if you live in the greater Washington area, you know a lot better, because in Northern Virginia, the state has completely been transformed. And it's not just that Northern Virginia wags the tail of the entire rest of the state of Virginia, but it does so in a way that is incredibly unhealthy. And of course, if you are a Democrat listening to this podcast, you're probably going, oh, you're just mad because Virginia has now been flipped to a blue state. Folks, Virginia was not flipped to a blue state because of the fact that there are better ideas on the Democrat side and better policy solutions. Virginia has flipped to a blue state because of massive illegal immigration in Northern Virginia, which, as I said, wags the rest of the state, makes the rest of the state do whatever it wants, because Northern Virginia is where all of the population is. And one of those counties is Fairfax, Virginia. But podcast listeners should know that Fairfax, Virginia is a massive county, not just in size, but in population. I think it has an excess of 1 million people that live in that county. And it was traditionally a very family-oriented county. It was traditionally a county that was always very wealthy. It was traditionally a county that people really cared about getting up and out, and had a terrific public school system, safe neighborhoods. And quite frankly, in Fairfax County, many people actually were critical thinkers for many, many decades. That is to say, they would vote for good policies. They wouldn't really vote for the politician. And that's all changed. That's all changed because of massive immigration. And there's no better place to explain how massive immigration, illegal immigration, by the way, how massive illegal immigration combined with massive immigration will change an entire state, not to mention the county itself. And there's no better way of explaining that than a tweet by the Fairfax County Board of Education. And that tweet has sparked a backlash. And people want her to be recalled or removed. And this is not the first time this particular school board member has done something that is really inappropriate. So, as you know, we celebrated 9/11 not too long ago. And the Fairfax County Board member, her name is Abrar Almish. She calls herself a woman of faith. She tweeted on May 13th, Eid Mubarak, congrats on 30 days of worship. Hurts my heart to celebrate while Israel kills Palestinians and desecrates the Holy Land right now. We've actually talked about this particular tweet on a previous podcast. Apartheid and colonization were wrong yesterday and will be today, she says. May justice plus truth prevail. In other words, she's calling Israel a colonizer and a participant in apartheid. Dawn Weiss Smith, a Jewish mother with children in the school district, said her daughter reported that the tweet made her uncomfortable. Quote, my daughter said, for the first time in a long time, I actually feel unsafe and I don't want people to know I'm Jewish. That was horrifying for me as a parent, Smith said. Amish, who is the member in question of the school board, was set to be recognized Thursday by the Jewish Community Relations Council of Greater Washington for championing faith, equity, and unity in schools. Unity! Jeez, yeah, right, unity. Following her tweet, the group rescinded the offer, saying Ms. Omish broke that unity by tweeting a one-sided, inaccurate, and hateful statement that smeared Israel, defamed Israelis, and disfranchised the thousands of Jewish families in her district. So that happened in May. And you would think that Miss Omish would just, focus on her function as a member of the Fairfax County School Board. And she would focus on reading, writing, arithmetic, making sure that Fairfax County public school students are testing properly, making sure the schools are open and the kids are learning and that things are going well, and they keep, of course, politics out of it. But this particular individual is representative of that school board because the school board has become highly politicized and has been, by the way, for a few years. And it's a result of massive illegal immigration combined with massive legal immigration in that particular county in Virginia, Fairfax County, Virginia. And so that brings us to the 9/11 ceremonies that many school boards, for whatever reason, have decided to speak up about. I have to tell you that as someone who watched the same thing that all of you watched on 9/11 and watched those buildings being hit by planes and watched several thousand Americans die, it's important to remember what happened. It's important to remember and to hold to account those who did this and explain why they believe that and why they move forward, and to educate the children today about what happened in the very recent past, as well as to be accurate. Accuracy is very important. Well, not by this particular member of the Fairfax County School Board. So all the way over in the UK, even the Daily Mail picked this up. Scandal hit Virginia School Board faces calls to ditch member for woke-washing 9/11 after she says moment of silence for terror attacks caused harm and was not anti-racist. So this school board member said that after she says that the 9/11 terror attacks caused harm and was not anti-racist. In other words, after 9/11, there were more attacks against Muslims than there should have been in the United States, and therefore we should not talk about what happened on 9/11 and how it happened and who was responsible and why they believed what they believed and all that we've learned since to try to educate people. Instead, we shouldn't do that because there may be some backlash from that. Rather than, so in other words, she's saying don't use education to teach people what this is. And you wonder why the Middle East is a mess, right? You wonder why the Middle East is balkanized. Because for whatever reason, there are certain numbers of these individuals, and I'm going to say that these individuals, certain numbers of them, that just won't come into the 21st century. They don't want to learn. They don't know and don't understand the American experience. Why don't they understand the American experience? Well, because when you take over a county like Fairfax County that has over 1 million people in it, and you have massive immigration and massive illegal immigration combined, you then take over the county. By the way, Fairfax County was always one of the most wealthy counties in the country. And why do you think the illegal immigrants as well as the legal immigrants moved there? Because it was a wealthy county and they always had a great public school system that they have now, of course, taken over and run into the ground. Literally run into the ground. And so this same school board member was invited to speak at a high school commencement ceremony in Fairfax County. And I have to tell you something. I'm not a fan of, and I don't think school board members should be allowed to speak at high school commencements. That's not their job. Their job is to meet on a regular basis, to set policy for the public school systems and be the check and balance of the public school system and be the sounding board for the parents when the school system isn't being responsive. That has always been their function in the past. But the Democrats have figured out that if you take over school boards across America, then you can use them to implement wokeism and anti-history, as well as CRT and God knows what else. So this same individual on the school board in Fairfax County, an immigrant, a Muslim, and dresses the part. Here she is. She couldn't speak her open mind probably in her own country where she came from because, women can't do that in Saudi Arabia or Afghanistan or most other Middle Eastern countries. And she comes here, just hates America and hates on it. So we have a series of clips on this, and you just won't believe why was she allowed to speak in front of a public school to begin with at their commencement ceremony for graduating seniors. Well, she was. We have that clip, and here it is.
First, let us acknowledge the stolen land of the Manahoic people, on which we have learned, lived, and on which we celebrate today here in Fairfax. This theft is a reminder to us of what happens when we delay justice, when we don't speak up, when we don't stand up.
Yeah, so she has to start out the comment telling people that they are on stolen land, that they are having their commencement on stolen land. And why is that relevant, podcast listeners, to a commencement ceremony of high school students? By the way, the particular school that she was speaking at has an abysmal record of educating kids. Awful record. And what is she doing? She's engaging in politicization of the public school system, which is part of the problem across America. But Fairfax County, Virginia, a very wealthy county, a very large county in the greater Washington area and in Northern Virginia, is exemplary of what's happening across America. And it demonstrates what happens when you combine illegal immigration with massive immigration that is legal, and you bring people in who don't share the American experience, and you bring people in that don't even share the Western experience. They don't even agree with the Judeo-Christian traditions of Western civilization. In fact, they want to destroy them, even though in their own country, because they're a woman, they can't openly speak, and they can't even drive in some countries, and they can't go to college to get a degree. Incredible. So here is this same individual in the Fairfax County School Board talking about capitalism and white supremacy.
We struggle with human greed, racism, extreme versions of individualism and capitalism, white supremacy, growing wealth gaps, disease, climate crisis, extreme poverty amid luxury and waste right next door. And the list goes on. You all know this.
Yes. So she's acting like she's at a Democrat rally with all of the talking points about how our country is just so awful. It's such a terrible place. I mean, and she equates capitalism with white supremacy. And she talks about the climate crisis and everything else that is bad in America. And meanwhile, you probably have kids in this class that can't properly read, can't properly do math, can't properly write. And she calls herself a member of the Fairfax, Virginia School Board. And again, podcast listeners, her name is Abrar Amish. Abrar Amish. And she has been in the news many times. And you wonder why the state of Virginia has been flipped to a blue state when their largest county by population, and also probably the wealthiest county in Virginia, has been taken over by these types of individuals. And so here's the Washington Examiner, the newspaper, reporting on this same school board member when she was driving, okay? She was driving her car and she was texting, like incessantly texting. And the police officer finally was like, enough already. I have to pull her over because apparently she doesn't think that she ever has to look at the road. She can just continue to text forever. He pulls her over and does the simple thing that any police officer would do first and foremost. Says, ma'am, I've pulled you over because I observe you texting and driving, and you're putting yourself and others at risk. May I have your driver's license and registration? So we have a clip on this. It's slightly less than a minute. It's worth listening to this because it tells you about this woman's character and what she thinks about the citizens of the United States and what she thinks about our laws. Here's the clip.
That she was invited to make the keynote address speaks volumes about the school board and the leftward migration of Fairfax County in which she serves. She is no stranger to controversy. When running for the at-large seat on the school board, she was stopped for driving while texting and making an illegal turn on a red light. She disobeyed at least 12 commands from an officer to produce her license and registration. She refused to answer, refused to get out of the car.
Get out of the car right now.
I'll give you my license. I'll give you my license.
Get out of the car.
I didn't do anything. What?
Get out of the car now.
I'll give you my license, sir. What?
Last chance.
Sir, why? Tell me.
She ultimately was pepper sprayed and arrested. She pleaded no contest and told the Washington Post at the time, quote, she plans to pursue conversations with Fairfax County Police about implementing sensitivity training.
She, the member of the school board, wants to implement sensitivity training of Fairfax County Police when she speaks in a way that is so divisive and so hating on America and calls anyone who's white in the country white supremacists, hates capitalism, but meanwhile, she lives in a country that's giving her opportunities that she could never get in her own country in the Middle East. Never. And then she drives her car, and I'm glad that we played that long clip for podcast listeners because she drives her car, she's texting, she makes an illegal turn because obviously she's not focusing on the road, she's texting. The police officer pulls her over and he politely, and they didn't, play the whole part where he keeps asking her again and again and again, may I have your license and registration? And by the 12th time, he's like, well, then look, you got to get out of the car then. And then she changes her tune and acts like, this little innocent person who is shocked. And she's like, oh no, you can't do this. This is terrible. Hoping that that's going to change the first part of the body cam where she was a complete idiot and angry at the police officer and refuses to take responsibility for, of course, her texting and driving. And oh, by the way, texting and driving is not a crime. But it is a driving infraction and you're probably going to get a ticket for it. And she should have just sucked it up, gave the police officer her driver's license and registration card, taken the ticket, paid the ticket, and then no one would have been the wiser. But instead, of course, this makes national news because she decides to think that the law does not apply to her. Folks, this is a problem. This is the problem with massive immigration that is legal, as well as massive illegal immigration combined in a county like Fairfax County, where you have people that don't love America. They're not grateful for being in this country. And here she is in a wealthy county, and she's hating on the wealthy county that's giving her children and everybody else's children opportunities they would never, ever have in their home countries, ever. And instead, she gets pulled over and she tries to fake the fact that she's being persecuted by a police officer and then tries to go down that road until she realizes, guess what? There's body cam video of you literally saying to the police officer, the law doesn't apply to me. I'm a school board member and I'm a Muslim. Law doesn't apply to me. I don't recognize your country's laws. Incredible, ladies and gentlemen. And you'll wonder why the state of Virginia, where so many people from the rest of the world in Northern Virginia have come because of the sheer wealth of those areas and the sheer opportunity in those areas as a result of its proximity to Washington, D.C., which is, of course, spending unlimited amounts of money. You wonder why people go there. It's because of those jobs, because of all the government spending, because of all the government jobs, because of all the government benefits. And then they flipped the state to blue. So Virginia was not flipped to blue because of policy changes. Virginia, like this individual, okay, this individual in the school board, she doesn't have policy ideas that are unique. She doesn't want to build America. Virginia was flipped not because of ideas. They weren't flipped because Republican ideas are inferior or Democrat ideas are superior. They simply flipped because of the massive amount of immigration and illegal immigration combined with legal immigration. It's the only reason. It's the only reason. Otherwise, Virginia would be a right of center state. It would have maintained that without question. And you wonder why Democrats want more and more people to come across the border. And if you think that isn't enough, there was also a PTA official who resigned after she made the comment, "Let them die," because there were people that were protesting critical race theory. We played that earlier this year, just a couple of months ago. But in CNN, a leader in the Virginia Parent-Teacher Association who resigned after saying, quote, "let them die" during a speech attended by counter-protesters who opposed critical race theory being taught in Fairfax County public schools, says her comments were not aimed at them. Michelle Leet, the Virginia PTA vice president of training, was asked to resign after she made the controversial comments in front of a crowd, according to a statement from the Virginia PTA. Leet is also a member of the Fairfax, Virginia NAACP. Leet's comments were captured in video, taken outside Luther Jackson Middle School, where a Fairfax County, Virginia school board meeting was held Thursday night. Again, this was a couple of months ago, but it goes to Fairfax County. So let's meet and remain steadfast in the speaking truth, tearing down double standards and refuting double talk, Leet says in the video. Let's not allow any double downing on lies. Let's prepare our children for a world they deserve. Let's deny this off-key band of people. There are anti-education, anti-teacher, anti-equity, anti-history, anti-racial reckoning, anti-opportunities, anti-help people, anti-diversity, anti-platform, anti-science, anti-change agent, anti-social justice, anti-healthcare, anti-worker, anti-LGBTQ plus MOUSE, anti-children, anti-healthcare, anti-worker, anti-environment, anti-admissions policy change, anti-inclusion, anti-live and let people live. Let them die, she says. That was the quote. So that would be someone who is a parent who wants to engage the Fairfax County public school system through its PTA. And that is just, ladies and gentlemen, two basic examples of what has happened in Fairfax County, Virginia. You have a polarization of the electorate already happening in large part because the Democrat Party has engaged in, and by the way, so have many Republicans, massive legal and illegal immigration. You notice what we don't have? We don't have massive legal or illegal immigration from Eastern Europe, where people are naturally anti-communist and pro-democracy. You don't have that. Oh no, we don't want those people. You notice we don't have people coming from Korea en masse because the South Koreans understand what it's really like to have a country next to you that is a communist country, because many of them still have relatives in that communist country. And they hear all the stories about how awful things are. Notice we don't have massive immigration from Cuba or from Venezuela. Oh no, it's only from the countries that hate us. Only from those countries. And to be fair, we have massive immigration that is illegal from Mexico and Central America. And I do believe that those individuals don't hate us. I mean, they do share our values, except that the Democrat Party wants to get them on the Democrat plantation and get them on massive welfare subsidies so they vote Democrat. And of course, that's exactly what the Biden administration is doing. And so, case in point, podcast listeners, while you are sleeping, not paying attention, just trying to pay your bills, trying to get ahead of all of the inflation that's occurring in the economy, just trying to stay even while you were sleeping, in McAllen, Texas, at the airport, the Biden administration was quietly distributing individuals in the airport and sending them all over the country. All over the country. And thankfully, there's a great American and patriot who was there to videotape it and tweet what was actually happening. And this individual was not kidding. Every single person in the airport except for him and a handful of other people, were Hispanic. And they were clearly illegal and had not been processed in any way, shape, or form. They just crossed the border and now they're going to be sent all over the country. Where, we don't know. Well, in any event, what we do know is they were in McAllen, Texas, and this individual is basically videotaping them, and you really have to hear this 1-minute clip to really understand what is happening while you're sleeping. Here's the clip.
All right, people. Y'all want to see something buck wild, crazy? Much trouble as I just had getting into the United States. I'm at the McAllen Airport. I want y'all to look at this. Every person in here has either a red envelope, a green envelope, or a brown envelope. Not a single person speaks English, and all these are free airfare to different cities in the United States. Even the airport people are freaking out. Look at this craziness. Free airfare. They don't even have luggage. They got like bags of chips and stuff, and they're just sending them all across the U.S. Look at this lady right here. She's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 kids and doesn't even have any luggage. No luggage. No food. Nothing. This is the Biden administration and what they're doing.
So one woman there has 5 children. And if you can't see the video because you're listening to the podcast, the 5 children were all under the age of like 10. All of them. All 5 children. And do you have a right to have 5 children? You sure do. Do you have a right to have 5 children all under the age of 10 and then cross the border illegally and come into the United States? And then what do you think happens next? Well, you might move to a place like Fairfax County, Virginia. And your children then are going to be going to Fairfax County Public Schools. Fairfax County Public Schools then become completely overwhelmed with children who do not speak English. And in addition to that, Fairfax County Public Schools have to build a whole bunch of new public schools. And the taxpayers then have to have property taxes raised and or income taxes raised to pay for all of those new schools and to pay for this woman's 5 children to go to the public schools in Fairfax County, Virginia, because we know she's not going to be paying taxes because she's going to be showing up without a job because she's not a citizen of the United States. So here we are. We're not only being impacted, and I'm talking about all of us, by this increase in population and the changes it's causing in the state of Virginia. And by changes, I don't mean just demographic changes, folks. I'm talking about the changes in politics, right? Will this woman get a job? Can she really support her 5 children in the United States of America with inflation and prices being where they are today? There's no way. There's no way. This individual with her 5 children is going to be on welfare from day one. I can guarantee you. I can guarantee you. And so we have to ask ourselves the question, what kind of president of the United States would be doing this at a time when he's talking about everybody has to be vaccinated and COVID is really, out of control and we might have to shut schools down because of COVID, and the fact that, how about our hospitals? And this is the part that no one's talking about. When you go into a hospital emergency room and you're the person who's been paying taxes your whole life, you've been employed your whole life, you've never been on welfare, you refuse to, no matter how little money you have, you just tough it out and you make it through because you're a proud American. And then you go to your local hospital because you aren't feeling very well for whatever reason. Maybe it isn't COVID, maybe it's COVID, maybe it's just something else, right? Maybe you have a severe groin pain and you think it might be appendicitis and you walk into the emergency room. Do you know who's in those emergency rooms? They're completely and almost utterly occupied by people who are here illegally because they don't have health care. So they go to the hospital to get it. And then we, the people who are paying for these hospitals, are then in a situation where we may or may not get in a timely manner. And you have to, why isn't this part of the discussion? Immigration has to be sustainable. It has to be sustainable for our hospitals, for our medical system, for our public schools. They can't continuously be building public schools. I mean, how many more new public schools have to be built in Fairfax County, Virginia? They have to be, immigration has to be legal and has to be paired properly with the availability of jobs. I mean, last time I checked, while there were a lot of jobs that weren't being filled, there were also a lot of people that are afraid to go back to work, and then we're bringing people in. They're not vaccinated. I mean, all of this really doesn't make sense unless you are the most sinister elected official imaginable, such as most of the Democrat Party, who simply wants to flip states like Virginia. And you overwhelm the state's largest jurisdiction with illegal immigrants, by the way, by podcast listeners, in Fairfax County, Virginia. 37% of the kids don't speak English when they go home. All right. I'm sure they barely speak English when they're in the classroom, which costs a fortune because the school system has to hire people who speak their native language as well as English and teach them in both languages simultaneously, hoping that they can eventually learn English proficient enough to be able to properly function in an English-speaking society. Yeah, podcast listeners, I did say that. We are an English-speaking society. Suck it up. And you have 37% of the kids going home and they're not speaking English as their primary language. And I'm sure the percentage is much larger than that, but because that by the way, statistic was taken a number of years ago. And I'm not really sure I believe the statistics as they stand, because anyone, as I said, who knows Fairfax County, Virginia, understands that it is a place that when you go there to the shopping mall, you say to yourself, am I in the United States of America? I mean, what the heck? I mean, you feel like you're in either the Middle East or that you're in Central America, depending on what part of Northern Virginia you're in. And you have to ask yourself the question, how much is this costing our federal government? And how much is it costing the people of the state of Virginia? And who voted for this? We didn't vote for this. This is our federal government failing us, but doing it intentionally. Clearly now it's the Biden administration that's out of control. But in the past, the Bush administration, did this as well. I mean, so it's Republicans and Democrats, and we all know it. And we need to push back on this because we will not have a country in one generation. I'm convinced in 10 years, we will not have a country. It will not be recognizable because people won't have a sense of our history and they're just going to be hating on our country. And so next up, podcast listeners, speaking of that issue of the border, Texas law enforcement has stormed the border because the Biden administration won't do anything. So in the Daily Wire, Texas law enforcement stormed the border with scores of vehicles secure the area after Biden has failed to do anything. Law enforcement officials with the state of Texas appear to have taken control of the situation in Del Rio, Texas, after the Biden administration repeatedly failed to stop tens of thousands of migrants from illegally entering the United States. The Texas Department of Public Safety is in full force along the border around the Del Rio area, Governor Greg Abbott said in a tweet that featured a picture showing scores of law enforcement vehicles that had descended on the area. Quote, they have built a barricade with their squad cars and state troopers. The National Guard is working with them to secure the border. Fox News national correspondent Bill Melugin tweeted out a video showing the massive surge in law enforcement presence at the border. He says, there is a massive surge of Texas DPS troopers heading into the International Bridge area in Del Rio, with close to 15,000 migrants currently under the bridge. Law enforcement sources say they want to be proactive with potential security concerns for such a big group. The Texas Department of Public Safety tweeted out photographs from both the ground and from their drone that showed the scale of Abbott's response to the crisis that started last week and erupted over the last few days. And keep in mind, podcast listeners, that the Biden administration under Pete Buttigieg, the Secretary of Transportation, wouldn't allow Fox News to fly drones to be able to see actually the state of the crisis and the scope of the crisis. So Fox News simply contacted Governor Abbott and he took them up in helicopters. So apparently Texas got cleared by the FAA, but Fox News couldn't, a news reporting agency, couldn't report the news. The move by Abbott comes as approximately 15,000 illegal aliens had flooded the area in recent days, and there were few signs of the situation getting any better. The New York Times reported that local officials have described the scene as one resembling a shantytown, with little access to clean water and food and just a few portable toilets. The Times noted that there was no running water at the site, and photos showed people having to carry large packages of bottled water to the area. So I'm going to stop there, podcast listeners, and say this. You saw the shantytown from the air just like I did. Well, what I heard during the Trump administration, there were kids in cages. The kids were in detention centers and adults were in detention centers, and they were separated because many of them were taken here, many of the kids, that is, were brought to the United States, as they still are, to engage in the sex trade and other nefarious acts. And the United States of America doesn't know who's who until you separate them and interview them and find out. And we've spoken about this before, but it's because they were detained in jail cells. The Democrats got a great talking point. Kids in cages, kids in cages. Now we see 15 to 20,000 people on the border of Texas, and it's a shanty town. I mean, it looks like Haiti. Looks like the country of Haiti. And it's not because of the color of the skin, because there are people who are Hispanic and there are people who are Haitian who have come to this place, and they've created a shanty town because they're literally tearing down the forest and clear cutting it and creating like little places to live in. You've got the river there. They're going on the river and bathing, and I'm sure going to the bathroom because there isn't running water. And then you have, of course, trash everywhere. And along the river, you see like clothing and all kinds of other items that were discarded, because this is the education level of the individuals that are now at our border, because they don't care about the environment. Apparently, Democrats don't care about the environment either, because you see how they're destroying the environment in this shanty town. But apparently, a shanty town of 20,000 people is better than kids in cages, where they're actually being fed and given bottled water and have access to showers and toilets. But no, this is better. And we can't talk about it because it really doesn't exist as long as Fox News can't report on it, because we know CBS and ABC and NBC and CNN and MSNBC are not going to report on it. And so I have to wonder the next question about why this isn't being reported. So we have 20,000 apparently Haitians that are making their way there at the same location in Texas, or may already be there. Now, to be fair, I've heard everything from 8,000 Haitians to 20,000 Haitians. Maybe there are 8,000 there now, and maybe there are another, 15,000 that are on their way there. I'm not sure, because I've seen different reporting on this. But let's suffice it to say there are many thousands of Haitians amongst these individuals who are predominantly from Central America that are in this shantytown. And the Biden administration is now saying, you know what we're going to do? We're going to deport not one of the Haitians, but all of them. Wait a minute. They're black. Why are we allowing the Hispanics in, but deporting the people who are black? Why isn't the media talking about that? Why is it that illegal immigration is okay? We don't report about it, but then we talk about Trump putting kids in cages, and that's like racist. But now we have the Biden administration saying, well, if you're black, you're going back to Haiti. It wasn't right that you went across on boats or you went across in planes, got to Central America or Mexico by plane or by boat or however you got there, and then walked, like a couple thousand miles to the border. You're different than the people that walked a couple thousand miles from the border who are Hispanic. You shouldn't be allowed because you're black. We're sending you back to Haiti. That is a fact. That's exactly what the Biden administration is doing. Why hasn't that been reported? I mean, doesn't that bother you just a little bit? So Governor Abbott, understanding all this, not only sent people to the border, he signed a nearly $2 billion border security bill funding the Texas border wall construction. So the citizens of Texas now are going to have to use taxpayer money and perhaps some of it's stimulus money too, I don't know, but more than likely taxpayer money to not only build and finish the border wall, but also to police it, since the Biden administration doesn't seem to care about who's coming to America. Unless you're black, then you get sent back. So Governor Greg Abbott signed a bill into law Friday that provides nearly $2 billion in additional funds to increase immigration jail capacity and to build Texas's version of a border wall with Mexico. And this is in the Dallas Morning News. The $1.8 billion bill will nearly triple what Texas spends on border security over the next 2 years, which Abbott said is necessary due to what he described as failed policies by the federal government. These funds, quote, are needed because the Biden administration's open border policies have opened the floodgates to illegal immigration, to crime, to human trafficking, to drug smuggling, he said. Abbott signed the bill in Fort Worth at the Police Officers Association building, according to Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick and Representative Greg Bonin, who's a Republican from Friendswood, who is chairman of the House Appropriations Committee. Abbott wanted to increase jail capacity in order to hold thousands of migrants on state charges of trespassing for up to 1 year. Grants for local counties and law enforcement at the border were also included in the funding. So can you imagine if if Abbott were to do that, which apparently he is, they're going to build more jails and holding cells to say, hey, look, you're trespassing in the state of Texas and on private property. So we're going to detain you for up to a year in hopes that at some point the Biden administration gets their mind back. But of course, the Biden administration wants to create Fairfax counties all over the country, because when you can create a Fairfax County, Virginia, you can also create a Fairfax County, Texas, and a Fairfax County, Ohio, and a Fairfax County, Florida, and a Fairfax County, Georgia, and a Fairfax County, Arizona. And that way, you permanently flip American elections with individuals who have very little interest in the history of the United States and on what made us such a great country and such a wonderful place. And then you flip it and the country turns into a complete mess like the state of California. And by the way, podcast listeners, it did occur to me, didn't it occur to you, when you saw the shanty town from the air in Del Rio, Texas? You know, you got the drones flying and you see the shanty town and they're using sticks to build huts and so forth. And they're bathing in the water and they're defecating on the ground and then cleaning themselves and their clothes and just trash everywhere. You know what that reminds me of? The streets of California, in San Francisco, and in Los Angeles. So coming to a town nearest you, oh, we've got some great stuff for you. It's more squalor at a time when we can least afford it as a country. So next up, podcast listeners, Chuck Todd got himself in big trouble because he dared to say that Joe Biden has created a credibility crisis, meaning that Joe Biden has a credibility problem with pretty much every issue imaginable. So host of NBC News, Willie Geist, interviewed Chuck Todd right before the Meet the Depressed show. Meet the Press show, of course. But the Meet the Depressed show from Chuck Todd, he gets up there, and Chuck Todd actually seemed to be pretty straightforward, which is highly unusual for Chuck Todd when interviewed about what he was going to talk about in his show this past Sunday. So here's Willie Geist setting up the interview with a question, and here's the question.
Chuck, good morning. It's good to see you. So we can talk about the border crisis. We can talk about the period of about 1 hour on Friday, where we learned that the drone strike that had been touted as an attack and a victory over ISIS actually killed a group of civilians, including 7 children. France recalling its ambassador from Washington because of that nuclear deal they were cut out of between the United States and the UK and Australia. And also the COVID booster news. That all came on Friday. How is the White House managing all this, and what do you expect to hear from the president at the UN on Tuesday?
In other words, how is the White House managing all the lies coming out of the Biden administration, including Joe Biden's mouth, about the need for a COVID booster when you really don't need one, the fact that it's approved and it's safe when the FDA said it wasn't, the fact and it wasn't for people that are under 65 and healthy. Specifically, that's what the FDA said, by the way, about the booster shots, and about the nuclear sharing technology with the UK and Australia, and that France is really upset and recalled their ambassador, and the fact that the border crisis is a mess and Biden won't even address it and says, oh, no, everything's fine at the border. Well, here is Chuck Todd's response. Pretty shocking for someone from NBC News. Here it is. We have that clip. Here it is.
Well, look, I think he's got a pretty big credibility crisis on his hands, because all of these problems in some ways showed up after he said something basically the exact opposite. Afghanistan withdrawal wasn't going to be messy. This wasn't going to look like Saigon. The booster shots, he came out and he essentially said 8 months and even indicated maybe we should start it as soon as 5 months. Now we're not sure if anybody under 65 is going to get a booster shot. So, he's had, and of course the border has been, whether this is, we can talk about the border problems. You could say there's years in the making, but it's pretty clear we have a bigger problem now than we've had in years. And these policies have turned into becoming a magnet.
Yes, of course, the policies have turned into being a magnet. We have people coming into the country because essentially the Biden administration said, hey, new sheriff in town, border is open. And now we have this massive crisis. And then you have a shanty town that develops, and Biden doesn't even have a plan to deal with the shanty town. I mean, can you imagine? And so we've heard so far during this podcast, we heard in McAllen, Texas, immigrants who are illegal are being put in airports and they're being given free plane tickets, free money, free assistance, and sent all over the country, but we don't know where and we're not being told. It had to be someone who actually was in the airport, who was nice enough to videotape all of this and send us the information so that we even knew it was happening, because NBC isn't reporting it. CBS isn't reporting it. ABC is not. MSNBC is not. And of course, there are only so many resources available that any one news company can have to find out what's going on. So they have to rely on people in the field to tell us that our president of the United States and his advisors and his administration are in the process of undermining the Constitution of the United States while we are sleeping. And Chuck Todd is like, well, yeah, the president has a credibility crisis because he just has a hard time telling us the way things are and what's really happening. I mean, that's because Chuck Todd realizes that the polls are just dropping like crazy for President Biden, and he's just losing so much support. And case in point, the key Democrat in the Senate wants to nuke the voting on Biden's colossal $3.5 trillion wish list bill. So a top Democrat senator, and you know who this is, of course, appears to be leaning towards stalling the vote on President Joe Biden's massive $3.5 trillion social spending bill that has been largely criticized as a partisan wish list for the Democrat Party. Senator Joe Manchin is privately saying he thinks Congress should take a strategic pause until 2022 before voting on President Biden's $3.5 trillion social spending package. Axios reported, quote, Manchin's new timeline, if he insists on it, would disrupt the plans by House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer to vote on the budget reconciliation package this month. And so here is in part what Joe Manchin wrote. He said, while some have suggested this reconciliation legislation must be passed now, I believe that making budgetary decisions under artificial political deadlines never leads to good policy or sound decisions. I have always said, if I can't explain it, I can't vote for it. And I can't explain why my Democrat colleagues are rushing to spend $3.5 trillion. Another reason to pause, he said. We must allow for a complete reporting and analysis of the implications a multi-trillion-dollar bill will have for this generation and the next. Such a strategic pause will allow every member of Congress to use the transparent committee process to debate what should we fund and what can we simply not afford. Manchin continues, I, for one, won't support a $3.5 trillion bill or anywhere near that level of additional spending without greater clarity about why Congress chooses to ignore the serious effects inflation and debt have on existing government programs. This is even more important now as the Social Security and Medicare trustees have sounded the alarm that these life-saving programs will be insolvent and benefits could start be reduced as early as 2026 for Medicare and 2033, a year earlier than previously reported for Social Security. So his point is establishing an artificial $3.5 trillion spending number and then reverse engineering the partisan social priorities that should be funded isn't how you make good policy. So good for you, Joe Manchin, and a very well thought out reason of why he won't vote for it. If you have Medicare going broke in 2026 with this $3.5 trillion spending included this year, and Social Security going broke by 2033, then what would be the point of spending $3.5 trillion if you can't pay for your existing responsibilities and liabilities and obligations? Why is this hard? Why don't Democrats understand simple math? What is happening to our country with these idiots who are elected? And good for you, Joe Manchin, a Democrat from West Virginia, who actually is standing up going, have y'all lost your mind? I mean, I have people in West Virginia who rely on Social Security and Medicare, and how are they going to pay for it if the government runs out of money and can't afford it anymore? And what about the inflationary aspects of this bill? Well, that should be pretty obvious. I mean, CNBC, Kayla Tausch of CNBC was reporting on what would happen if you lift the debt ceiling. So there's a ceiling the federal government has on how much money they can borrow and then spend. And all the government has to do is vote to lift the debt ceiling, at which point they can then go borrow more money up to that next debt ceiling. So the government has hit the debt ceiling. And then you have the $3.5 trillion spending package that isn't even included in that, having to lift the debt ceiling because they keep spending and spending. And Kayla Tausch of CNBC is like, well, will this cause inflation? I'm not really sure. We have that clip, and here it is.
Good to see you. This is a memo that was circulated by the White House earlier today, warning of the economic consequences that the country would face if, in fact, the debt limit is hit and those extraordinary measures are exhausted, which the Treasury Secretary said would happen next month. In this memo that the White House put out this morning, the operative line is where it says hitting the debt ceiling could cause a recession. Economic growth would falter, unemployment would rise, and the labor market could lose millions of jobs. The White House also notes that certain state programs like disaster relief, child nutrition programs, and more would see their funding effectively halted if, in fact, the United States could not make its obligations, if, in fact, the debt limit is failed to be lifted. Now, of course,
so that's the White House saying we have to lift the debt ceiling because we won't be able to borrow money to pay for our existing obligations. Yet they want to spend an additional $3.5 trillion before this debt ceiling is lifted. And that might cause us to have the inability to pay for Social Security and for Medicare. I mean, do Democrats not understand basic? And by the way, a CEO of a top investment firm says inflation is already hitting his entire portfolio. So we already have inflation. Inflation is now in every aspect of the economy. Initially, they said it was just in lumber and it's temporary. Then it was, oh, it's in food, but that's temporary. It's not temporary with food. The prices, I think, are pretty much here to stay. It's now hitting every aspect of the economy. So the chief executive of a leading investment firm said that inflation is hitting every portion of the company's portfolio. Mark Rowan, the CEO of Apollo Global Management, which controls $472 billion in assets, said in an interview with CNBC that rising price levels are affecting every portion of his business. Quote, there's not a place where we are not seeing inflation. Everything that we once did now costs more, Rowan explained to CNBC's Leslie Picker. Lead times, pressure on inventory, pressure on supplies, pressure on employment, our experience and our portfolio is really no different than the broader economy. Rowan said this: it remains to be seen if inflation proves to be transitory, that is, temporary. As Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell has repeatedly said, it's just temporary. Still, Rowan believes the price increases will ease as the recent spending boom decreases. Well, but that's the problem. The spending boom will probably continue because the Democrats are in control. And but for Joe Manchin, who has stopped this so far, that spending is very likely to continue. And so, ladies and gentlemen, podcast listeners, why is there inflation? Inflation is because the government is spending too much money and printing too much money. That's why. And we have a government that wants to lift the debt ceiling so it can borrow more money, so that it can spend more money and print more money, which is going to cause inflation to continue and to expand. And that is Democrat Economics 101. So that's it for Mark and the Millennials. Thank you for joining Mark and the Millennials. This is Mark Fisher. Thank you to our producer, Christopher Hopkins. Check us out on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Parler, Rumble, and our website. See you next time.